To begin, there will be spoilers for all of Buffy and Angel, as well as the Claremont X-Men books. All right, with that out of the way, let's proceed. In this essay, we're going to be looking at how Kitty Pryde acts as the sort of model or Willow Rosenberg in the Buffyverse. Although Willow did appear in Angel as well, but we're going to cover mainly the Buffyverse and her impact there. So, who is Kitty Pryde? Well, Kitty Pryde is essentially this young Jewish teenager who has the power to become intangible. Now, Willow's very different. She doesn't have mutant power, but there's a lot of overlap in the fact that they're both young Jewish teenagers. They're sort of the runts of their respective groups, right? The X-Men and Buffy's team, who helps her out in the early seasons. There's also obviously the Giles character, who's sort of like Xavier, a mentor figure for the group when they're in high school. Then there's the analogy of the persecuted minority, which the early seasons of Buffy really played on, right? People in high school feel persecuted, and of course, the mutants in the X-Men verse are also a persecuted minority. There's also an interesting overlap, again, but it's weaker. We have to admit it is weaker, that there is a touch of the supernatural with Kitty Pryde in particular because she has a pet dragon. And of course, we know that Willow eventually becomes a witch, and a very powerful witch. There's even a supernatural aspect to this X-Man in particular. So Kitty does have a kind of supernatural link, just like Willow. That said, there are some differences because although Willow does have a kind of double identity as Buffy's sidekick within the high school years, she never takes on a formal secret identity. But Kitty Pryde does. She's called Shadowcat. Now, I know more recently they probably dropped the Shadowcat persona, but again, she did at one time consider herself Shadowcat. The double identity thing with superheroes is not totally picked up on with Willow. And although there are some physical resemblance between Xander and Colossus, who's this much taller, stronger kind of boyfriend that Kitty Pryde has, that's not an analogy that totally holds up because Colossus is Russian, but Xander is somebody native to Sunnydale, so he doesn't have that exotic touch that Colossus does. He's also not a mutant, right? Xander never develops superpowers, which I appreciated, so he's also very different from Colossus. Also, Kitty and Colossus eventually get married in many stories. Xander and Willow just remain friends. They only are briefly in a relationship within the high school years, and that's it. And then they primarily are friends to one another. Although you can probably say that they're sort of like more like family members, but they never become lovers in a sustained way. So there are still major differences. And finally, we have the Spike-Willow dynamic, which I think is very interesting. And there is a kind of parallel with Wolverine. And there's obviously a very strong parallel between Wolverine and Spike, that they both have these weird pasts, right? They're more anti-heroes than heroes. They've lived a very, very long time. I mean, technically, they're probably very similar ages, actually. So they're almost identical in age. And the relationship to the X-Men is very twisted, right? He's more of an ally, and he is friends with some people, but he's not close to the entire group. But Wolverine's relationship, I think, to Kitty in particular, is more of like a big brother. They have sometimes hinted that they're attracted to one another sexually, and that's also true with Spike and Willow, but there it's a much more abusive relationship. But it's also kind of strange because Joss framed it as a more comedic moment when Spike attacks Willow, and Willow herself does not see herself as sexually attractive, even in season 4. So it's a little bizarre and twisted, and it may be impacted by his real-world beliefs, but we're not going to get into Joss's kind of real-world drama, but obviously that's in the background. Because he did admit he kind of created Kitty as a kind of girlfriend figure for himself, because growing up he just couldn't imagine himself really being ever attractive to somebody like Jean Grey or Storm, right? This kind of model of the superheroine as really tall with big breasts and things like that. And Willow's a kind of next-door girl model that he fashioned for himself, and it fit with Kitty, who he grew up reading, and he considers Kitty a really important character. The Spike-Willow dynamic is really interesting and does parallel, but again, we have to be careful it doesn't go all the way, because even though they are friendly with one another, their exact relationship is never really clarified. But I do think with Wolverine and Kitty, it is much more fully stated that they are full friends, and that he will do things for her without expecting anything back. Whereas with Spike, the relationship between Willow and Spike is always sort of contractual. Right? There's always a lot of negotiating going on between the two. So there is a major difference between Wolverine and Spike. And then we get to the fall to evil, which is probably the most controversial aspect of Willow and her becoming Dark Willow. Obviously, the parallel to the X-Men verse is Dark Phoenix, but this is, I think, where Joss leaning on the Marvel Comics does not make a lot of sense, or it wasn't executed quite rightly. So let me just add in a brief note. In the original plan, Oz was going to be killed by Angel. Angel was not going to kill Jenny. Angel was going to kill Oz. Now, if they had followed that original plan, Willow becoming Dark Willow would have made a lot more sense. But as we have it, the only thing that pushes her to become Dark Willow is the death of Tara. That's not saying anything bad about Amber Benson, but it's still in my mind a big gap why Tara's death alone pushes her first to kill Warren, and then after Warren, she wants to kill Jonathan and the whole trio. It didn't quite make a lot of sense to me. It seems like that's quite a big leap, first to kill Warren and then try to kill off the other two. I can understand her wanting vengeance against Warren, but why would you want to kill Jonathan? It just didn't make sense. And there's just a disjunction between Dark Phoenix and Dark Willow, because Dark Phoenix is not literal dark in the sense of the Buffyverse dark, right? She's not demonic, she's not evil. It's just that Phoenix is a cosmic being who's so powerful, she's endangering everybody, right? Because she can just destroy a whole world. But she's not malevolent. She's just a cosmic being that has her own way of being. It just doesn't fit with human beings. But Dark Willow is and remains human. She has superpowers, but I don't think she becomes a cosmic entity. Obviously, it's complicated with Season 7, where it appears, at least briefly, does become a goddess or has goddess-like powers at the very end of Season 7, but we're not given enough clarity, so it's unclear whether Willow ever becomes a full-blown cosmic entity like the Dark Phoenix. If so, then the analogy kind of fits, but again, we're not given enough with the plot or the events, so it's really hard to say. So if we ask the simple question, who is Willow Rosenberg? I think we can say she's Kitty, who was transformed into Dark Phoenix briefly, and then back to Kitty. And I think obviously the Kitty part of the storyline is the strongest, especially her developing her confidence, becoming more sexually aware, experimenting, and things like that. That's probably the best Willow, because we see her becoming a fully formed self and sort of taking a lot of the Kitty Pryde persona, but changing it as she becomes a really powerful witch. But I have to say the Dark Phoenix kind of zigzag doesn't quite make sense. I understand it was an homage, but it really doesn't make sense with the way Chris Claremont originally envisioned Phoenix. It's really an intergalactic cosmic conflict. It's not just the X-Men. The X-Men have to deal with how these other races, the Kree, the Shi'ar, are contending with the Phoenix. And the Buffyverse does have aliens and things like that, but their struggles are not intergalactic. Good or bad, what they're dealing with affects Earth and Earth primarily. So it just didn't seem right to give Willow that much amount of power, because is she a cosmic entity? Is she not a cosmic entity? Is she a global threat? Is she a local threat? It just wasn't very clear. And Dark Willow doesn't stay with us long enough, so we don't know what is she. Is she a dark persona of Willow? Is she literally another character? It seems if you're going to do a fall to evil storyline, what you really need is an external source, especially with somebody like Willow, because we've just seen Willow too much, and we know this is just not like her. It takes a lot to make Willow vengeful or evil. That's not to take away things from Season 6. It's not my favorite season, but to give it its best argument, we do sort of see her slowly abusing her magical powers. But I do think overall, if she's becoming evil, and I do think they framed Dark Willow as evil, it would have been better if an external influence like Sidious or some kind of mentor figure distorts her or twists her. And that's perhaps why she becomes Dark Willow. But here, it just felt really just a plot convenience that they thought it would be clever. Oh, you thought she was Kitty Pryde, but really she's this other X-Men character. And I understand from that perspective it feels very clever and interesting, kind of smashing the characters together. But I think this is one of the problems with the Marvel Universe, is that we have the Hulk, who's just really strong, right? We have Tony Stark, who's very arrogant, or Captain America, who has the super soldier serum. And it's tempting to just mix the characters up because they just are so broad and big in scope. But I think that's a mistake, and I think this shows where Joss is not a good comic book reader, that he doesn't realize these are all very particular identities, and you can't transform them all the way. You have to be very careful and delicate how you're mixing the elements, or it just won't work. And we're going to see this in a future essay when I deal with Buffy and her parallels to Spider-Man. But this has been a profile on Willow Rosenberg as Kitty Pryde in the X-Men and Buffyverse. Thank you for listening.